What is the point of humility in relationship with eternal God? Is it merely submissive? Is it to have God as the boss? No, but let me explain something that Holy Spirit shared for perspective. Reality is truth, and the greatest reality is God. If we live in a broken reality, or in other words, a misperception, we are daily confronted with wrong living, separation from true purpose, and our eternity is at stake. Jesus realigns us with truth, with reality, and eternity. So, what's so bad about the other outcomes? Well, Jesus says, I never knew you to some of those that are out of touch with reality. Being misaligned with that finality of all things inwardly is a rejection of God's future, God's reality. And despite there being many opinions, there is no other future. So let's go one layer deeper. In Genesis chapter 3, the curse of sin is explained as introducing the multiplication of pain, suffering, and ultimately the futility that leads to death. That's not a sentence that God placed to show off or be mean. He did this because he's just, and sin's consequences at that time for Adam and Eve had no redemption plan that could be expressed in that moment. The price was the price. Romans 6:16 says this about sin as well. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? The sentence is clear. Sin's course is death. It follows it in natural progression. Now let's come back to humility and reality. If reality to you is really sin in the eternal scheme of things, then death is the natural course of action that follows. It's like planting and tending a seed that you think is one thing, but it turns out to be another. From this idea, humility is God's way of saving us from the realities of death. That begs the question, do you ever wonder what mechanism is at work that changes our course? As believers, to be straightforward, we no longer agree with death. Death is man's curse brought on by sin that fashions reality that says, no matter what you do, it's futile. Eventually, I will taste death, and that will become my reality. But through humility, humbling ourselves to God is the escape God has intended for us to leave the determined nature of sin that leads to death. God can mend our perception and gives us the tools that produce good works, just like it's reflected in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 to 24. The writer of Hebrews puts it like this: let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Humility is God's mechanism that starts the restoration process, in other words. Here in Hebrews chapter 10, the reality of someone who's embraced God as reality, that he's allowed to change perception and approach. Reality is hope, and we hold on to hope, and we humble ourselves to his faithfulness, and we then, through humility, consider one another and stir up the love of God and the good works in tandem with the love of God. See, humility is God's mechanism that starts the restoration process. It begins to sync us with his resurrection, way, truth, and life, as detailed conceptually in Hebrews chapter 10, as we just read. This substance is what founds eternity. What is absent, in other words, completely in death. As people, we don't set out to be prideful, but ultimately we develop a sense of self that is rather self-centered. At its best, this attempt at being selfless becomes practices that abandon aspects of care that require the connection, not only with suffering, but with redemption. But where does redemption come from? Well, it cannot ultimately come from a being, a person, heading on a collision course with death. It doesn't make sense. Redemption cannot come out from somebody that is adhering to the perception, the reality, and the course that agrees with death. A greater reality, in other words, must be exposed with a greater rule set and ruler. This is where God comes in, the greatest reality. And this is what is revealed through Jesus. And we're empowered to this day to continue in the reality of God from this life and into the life in eternity with the Holy Spirit, empowered by the Holy Spirit. This description is called synchronicity, connection of two of the same kind. If all we perceive is sin from the start, then our only reality can be death. Through and only through Jesus can we begin to even perceive and join up with a new reality. The reality entered through the humility and humbling of ourselves through the death and the resurrection of Jesus to be reconnected with God the Father. What's more is that humility exposes that our memory is conditioned to take God for granted. This is, after all, the disposition to sin. Remembering, memory, is what defines the moment, the day, the time, ultimately the conceptualization of what we think life is and what we think life is not, what we think we ought to do and what we think we ought not to do, from what we think is most valuable to what we think is least valuable. But humility through Christ helps us to evade the weight of grandiosity. Without Him in mind, our leaning to our own conveniences silently defines that reality is what I make it, that others around me matter only as extensions of myself, my needs, my desires, my strengths, my weaknesses, my goals. Ultimately, the truth to embrace is that our memory and our record kept of what life is about is a direct contradiction of what God tells us to do, say, and to recall. But the best news out of everything is that God has given us the ultimate pathway through humility to submission to Christ, allowing Him to be the director, the teller of truth, and the leader. This humility is our escape from the dressed up and decorated prison of death. He brings us and reorients us to the truth of the matter. Life is not a joyride, it's a specified assignment.